Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck. A very happy new year and of course a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks. Well, this week we're doing something a little bit self-indulgent on my part, I'm afraid. And that is taking a close look at a guitar tone which has not only long intrigued me but over the years has been shrouded in mystery, endless speculation and misinformation. It is of course Dire Straits' Money for Nothing. It's of course one of the most distinctive and iconic guitar tones and tracks ever committed to tape, but some 35 years after Brothers in Arms was released, there's still not a great deal of definitive information in regard to what specific gear was used on Money for Nothing. Needless to say, with so much time having passed, there's been conflicting reports coming from both Mark Knopfler himself and Neil Dorsman, the producer on the record. So today I thought it'd be a good chance to try and take a look at some of the speculation and hopefully some of the more definitive info which is available in regard to specific guitar, amp and of course wah pedal that was used on this track. Now, if you've seen any number of the documentaries made in recent years where Mark Knopfler talks you through how he plays Money for Nothing, you'll be forgiven for thinking that the guitar used on that track is of course his 1958 Les Paul Standard. However, there are two problems with that. First and foremost, he didn't buy that guitar until 1995, some 10 years after Brothers in Arms was released. However, arguably more problematic is that Neil Dorsman, the record's producer, swears blind that that guitar on that track was actually a Les Paul Jr., which, rather than a humbucker or pair of humbuckers, squarely places the tone on that track to a single P90. Now, this very much conflicts with the info which Mark Knopfler himself has given over the years, where he's been quoted on several occasions as saying the Money for Nothing guitar was in fact a 1959 reissue Les Paul made in the 70s, although the serial number on that guitar would actually date it to 1983. It was a guitar that he bought from Rudy Pencer in New York in 1984, a year before Brothers in Arms was recorded. Couple that with the fact that a fairly exhaustive look through Mark Knopfler's guitar collection doesn't really yield any examples of a Les Paul Jr., it doesn't really add up. Though for a second, if we do run with that theory that it was a Les Paul Jr., what I think may well be the case here is Neil Dorsman kind of confusing a Les Paul Jr. with a Les Paul Special, of which Mark Knopfler technically owns two. One, a standard Les Paul Special from 1958, and one, a double cutaway version from 1959, both of course having P90s. We know that at some point Mark modified that 1959 reissue Les Paul to have the middle position out of phase, so it's not really beyond the realms of possibility that the guitar used on Money for Nothing was in fact a P90 loaded Gibson. Of course, a lot of those P90 loaded Gibsons did leave the factory in the mid to late 50s out of phase as stock in that middle position. However, all of that said, if you look at footage from early 1985, really not very long after Brothers in Arms had been released, either taken from Live Aid or a few days prior at Wembley Arena, you can very clearly see Mark Knopfler using that 59 reissue on the bridge pickup alone, so that does seem marginally more likely. Now, this is actually the only part of the story where the two accounts, both Mark Knopfler's and Neil Dorsman's, actually align. That guitar tone, of course, being very distinctive and very typical of a wah pedal in a fixed position, just as Mark Knopfler explains here.
I had a wah pedal in it just to give it something different, and so we got the pedal, and as soon as it was in and set, that was the sound. You just, instead of it going whack, 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 and moving it with your foot, I just set it into a certain place, so it's probably just slicing through a very small little nasal.
So it's like a phasing thing, isn't it? Almost?
Yeah, it's just
and it gives it that really sort of unique sound.
The actual wah pedal that was used was reportedly made by Morley, which Mark Knopfler and Neil Dorsman actually spent a great deal of time adjusting, trying to get it into that fixed sweet spot that you hear on the record. However, ironically, the final piece of that nasal jigsaw fell into place totally by accident. Having left the studio one night, fairly convinced that they were at least in the sonic ballpark of the tone they were trying to achieve, upon returning to the studio the following morning, they found that one of the Shaw SM57s in Neil's typical 3-mic setup, two SM57s and one AKG 451, one of the 57s had actually come loose overnight and was now facing directly down towards the floor. Neil went into the live room to correct the now obviously wrong mic placement, only to be called back into the control room by an excited Mark Knopfler, telling him not to touch a thing. The rest is of course history, and despite the detailed notes which Neil made at the time, in case he ever needed to recreate that unique microphone placement, only several weeks later in New York, couldn't recreate it, leading him to call that guitar tone a happy accident. Last but not least, we have another part of the equation with, unsurprisingly, conflicting info, the amplifier. As Martin Knopfler recalls...
obviously, I had my Marshall there, we turned it up to as far as it would go, and we were going for a pretty heavy sound.
Now that Marshall is likely to have been a JTM 45 through a 4x12 cab. However, unsurprisingly, Neil Dorsman again has different recollections, and on numerous occasions has been quoted as saying it was either a Laney 2x12 combo or a Kelly amp. Now, I couldn't find any more specific info in regard to model numbers of those amps, so I'm going to take a leap of faith here and say that it was more than likely the Marshall that was in fact used on Money for Nothing. Couple that with the fact that it does sound a bit like a Marshall, and Mark has been fairly vocal over the years about the fact that he was very much shooting for a Billy Gibbons type guitar tone. I guess an obvious place to start in that respect is of course Marshall. So I guess the next logical step is to try and recreate the sound. For this, I'm going to be using Native Instruments Guitar Rig 5, try and recreate that Marshall tone, a Dunlop Slash SC95 to try and recreate that Morley wah sound, and two guitars actually, trying to get to the bottom of, ultimately, the Les Paul Special Junior versus Les Paul Standard debate. First of which is going to be a Daniel Guitars single cut gold top with two P90s, middle position of course being out of phase, and then the second guitar being my Patrick James Eggle Macon with two humbuckers. In this position I'm going to be using it exclusively on the bridge pickup. Last part of the equation then is going to be Logic's Match EQ plugin, which I'll be using to recreate any desk EQ or preamp coloration that you can hear on that original master recording. Now, listening back to those two clips, it's confirmed my initial thinking, to be honest. In as much as we all love a conspiracy theory, to me at least, it sounds far more likely to have been a single humbucker than either a pair or single in or out of phase P90s. Now, with that in mind, let's take a listen to the original master tape, back and forth with my recreation. See how close I got. So there you have it. Now, out of all of the How They Got the Tone videos I've done in the past, I think this one has arguably been the most difficult to really accurately recreate that guitar tone, and I still feel I'm a fair way off having nailed it. Primarily due to two main reasons, first and foremost of which it's a very specific wah pedal that was used. Of course, there's a very specific sweet spot on that wah pedal, which even if you had the exact gear here today, would be incredibly hard to recreate. Couple that with the unique mic placement or collection of microphones that were used on this track and where they were placed relative to speakers, which of course Neil Dorsman himself couldn't accurately recreate only several weeks later, gives the guitar tone a very full-bodied, full-frequency range sound, but still having that very prominent mid-range, which really cuts through and gives it that nasal quack that we know and love, and is incredibly distinctive and identifiable to Money for Nothing. Ultimately, I think I got close enough for jazz though. So as ever, thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe, hit the bell icon if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode of Friday Fretworks. Cheers guys, take care, and I'll just see you soon.